All right, everybody, welcome to another edition of the Sales Vitamin Podcast. Got a super guest today. He's got a brand new book that's out, Selling with Authentic Persuasion, transforming from order taker to quota breaker. And that's a great title. And Jason Cutter of Cutter Consulting Group is going to talk to us today. And Jason, thanks for joining us, man.
I am super excited. I love the idea of your show. As soon as I saw it, and a mutual friend of ours, Dale Dupree, as a guest on the show, and I
Yeah.
found out about you, and I was like, you gotta take your vitamins, man. And we've interacted a bunch, and I'm excited. I'm honored to be, maybe supplying some vitamins to some people.
Oh, I think everybody's going to get a jar full today, not just one. So let's talk about first, right off the bat. Let's talk about the book and what was the inspiration for doing. I know there's a history to it. It wasn't just something you thought and got up and said, "Hey, let me do this." But selling with authentic persuasion, transforming from order taker to quota buster or quota breaker. Where did all this start, and go back and take us through the process?
So, you're right. It wasn't an easy, simple. It's really the culmination of a kind of focused 2 years of working on it when I decided I got to write this book. I wasn't even working as a consultant at the time with my own business. I was actually an employee at a company. And I'm like, I just got this thing in me and I've got to get this thing out. Like, I want to write this book. Same reason I started my podcast was just like, there's this thing inside of me and I want to do it. And I'd started writing books years and years ago, and just got the doubt and the voice in my head. And this time it was just something completely different. Really, the reason why I wrote it and what it really contains is a collection of everything I've learned in my 17 plus years of sales and sales leadership, seeing lots of other people come and go, training people on how to be effective, and kind of the model that worked really well for me and works that I think really helps salespeople be effective, which is the authentic persuasion piece. It's about being themselves and then using persuasion to be effective. And that subtitle, the order taker part, is really the focus, because there's a lot of people who they're afraid of manipulating and being that person in sales. And so they don't go very hard at the sale because they're worried about being that person, because nobody likes that person and they don't like that person. And so what they do is they go the other extreme, which is order taker, which is hoping people buy, and you can't survive long-term in sales that way. And I think there's an amazing middle ground as a professional where you just go after it and you help the right people buy because you're the authority.
Yeah, and I saw, you know, and we talked a little bit before we started recording, but you're not a natural born sales guy, or a guy that said, "Hey, I'm going to get in sales right off the bat." I was came from a PR background or anything like that. You were a marine biology major and worked tagging sharks in the ocean. Tell me about, and tell the listeners about that. I mean, that's a big jump from tagging sharks in the ocean to selling. You didn't
No,
start selling.
it's about the same. No, and the joke that people ask is like, well, which is better, dealing with sharks in the ocean or sharks, in the sales floor, if you will. And I
Yeah.
would all day, every day, I'd rather deal with sharks in the ocean. They got one direction. You know what they're gonna do. They're pretty predictable. They got one thing on their mind. Humans are usually a little messier, and confusing, and unpredictable. So anyway, yeah, I mean, I grew up, my parents, before they retired, my mom was a banker and in finance, very analytical. My dad, analytical engineer, project manager, director, anti-sales household. In fact, kind of that classic manipulator. Oh, my mom as a banker, she saw bad things happen to people all the time on the finance side. So she would just tear apart any pushy bad salesperson. So I grew up in
Yeah.
that household, like not even just not a natural born salesperson, a anti salesperson kind of upbringing, such that I went into marine biology. I didn't see myself doing anything with people, just dealing with sharks and fish and aquariums. And so I did that. And then I couldn't get it, even with a great degree from UC Santa Cruz and years of tagging shark experience. couldn't get a job in the field. You needed a master's or
Wow.
beyond because it was so competitive in the late 90s that life took me many directions. I ended up working at Microsoft for a couple years doing tech support
I
when
saw
I moved
that.
to Seattle. And that wasn't what I wanted to be when I grew up. And then like most people, I fell into a sales role, started out in the mortgage business, and no training, no idea what I was doing, no strategy behind actually being effective on the sales side. And just a long career of figuring it out and then adapting and then helping other people.
When did it start to click that, hey, I'm pretty good at sales? Or did it start rocky and you were like, did you start out where, like, because most of the time when you get into sales like that, you're not very good and you kind of got to kick the can around a little bit.
Well, there was the fortunate, unfortunate side. I started out in sales. So I was 27 in 2002 in the mortgage business, height, heading to the peak of the real estate boom, the mortgage kind of everybody wanted to buy a house. So you didn't take much sales, right? Like people were begging you to give them piles of money so they could buy a house or refinance, right? It was
Yeah.
just easy. It didn't require sales. However, I still screwed up a lot and made a lot of mistakes that I still teach people to today to avoid. Because I just didn't know. And I, like not closing things appropriately, giving people too many options. I mean, I
Yeah.
would make spreadsheets of options and say, here's your 25 choices for mortgages. Let me know what you think. And they would just run away. And I'd never hear from them again because I,
Yeah.
stressed them out. And so, yeah, no, I didn't. And it wasn't until years and years later, probably about 2008, after years of doing different sales things, and I was at a company and was helping close deals for the team. And then I realized, wait a second, I'm really good at this. That's when it really started to click.
And now your company, the Cutter Consulting Group, you focus on inside sales for the most part. I'm assuming from what I've seen. Is that a little bit different than the outside B2B sales, or do you kind of tie it all together?
It's tough, right? Because, and most of your guests are all the same way, right? Is sales.
Yeah.
Everything is sales. I honestly feel like I could help any salesperson, any organization, anyone be more effective in sales in some way. And all of my experience has been inside sales, which means, telephone
Yeah.
related, inbound or outbound, but telephone related, and mostly business to consumer, so direct to consumer, but then also my clients on the consulting side have been mostly business to business. There's two parts. There's something just different when you're doing telephone sales. You don't have the value of the face-to-face, the reading, the
Yeah.
body language, the eye contact, building trust and rapport. You got to like do all of those things over the phone. So it's a totally different game, right?
Yeah.
It's a totally different game. And it's also much harder. And then you have to do it with effectiveness. And one of the things that I focused on in my career and now as a consultant is companies are helping them do inbound marketing. So they're either running ads or sending direct mail or even paying call centers to send them phone calls. But the salesperson is taking an inbound call to them, which means there's a cost. And when there's a cost, you need a high performance rate. And, that's where it gets really tricky.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. That phone sale, even though my career is outside sales, B2B outside in a field role, but on the phone, you don't get that feedback. You're kind of listening for that tone and some change there, but man, it is harder. And if you're good on the phone, that's a skill. I think that inside sales role is tough. What are the things that you see that really separates the people in that inside sales role that they're good on the phone, or if I was to word it differently, what do you see that, boy, when you come into an organization and work with them, what do you see right away that typically stands out that needs work?
That needs work. I mean, it's usually in terms of the questions and the listening part. So, dealing with that part to begin with.
Yeah.
Um, they usually don't know what to ask. They don't know why they're asking it. They don't know what they're looking for. And then when people say the answers, they're not listening and then adapting. There's a lot of people who end up in a sales role. There's not much training. There's not much coaching. There's not much leadership. They're kind of trying to figure it out on their own. and they have a list of questions or not, and
Yeah.
they're just kind of checking boxes. They're literally just trying to check the boxes, get through the question. Okay, let me get to the demo or the explanation, or let me start reading from the brochure and give you my features and benefits monologue.
Yeah.
And instead it's like, okay, and I tell people this all the time, if you have this, if it's a 30-minute conversation and you spend the first 15 minutes asking questions and getting information from them, that's a success. Like, don't feel like, okay, I've got 2 minutes for asking questions, let me get through those.
Yeah. Yeah. You've got a course that you offer that I thought was pretty interesting, Persuading Like a Professional. And I saw that on your
Yeah.
website. Talk to the listeners a little bit about that. How does that work, and how does that flow? How does that training flow? What's the keys for that course?
It's kind of in line with what I said about the book, but in a bit more detail, which is, it goes into the next part, which I was going to say, other after the questions, which is a perfect segue,
Yeah.
is a lot of people don't see it as their duty and responsibility to help qualified people move forward. One of the things they see is, okay, I'm a salesperson. If I'm too pushy, this is going to happen, but I don't want to be pushy. Buyers like to buy. They don't like to be sold to. All these classic things, right? That, some people are told. And the challenge is that if you're dealing with that prospective buyer and either they've come to you or you've come to them, and they need help trying to make a decision, then it's your duty and responsibility to help them make that decision. So one is uncovering their needs, wants, pains, desires, that side with the discovery. And then once you see they have problem X and you have solution X, then it's your duty and responsibility to not let them go without buying from you if you know that you can help them. If it's a good fit and you can get them into a better place, it's actually your responsibility. And in that course, I make a lot of comparisons to the medical profession, right? One of the challenges with sales profession is there's no profession, right? There's
Yeah.
no governing body. There's no certificates, that is
Yeah.
globally accepted, kind of institutional.
Right.
And, there's now, I don't know if you noticed, but there's now schools that you can get a bachelor's degree in sales.
I've
Um,
seen some.
yeah, which is wild, but there's no like universal kind of standard, which is part of the problem. But in the medical field, there is.
Oh
And
yeah.
so there's a process they have to follow, and there's an oath that they take. And, it would be like if you went into the emergency room with a broken leg and the doctor's like, and this is what happens in sales all the time, doctor says, well, your leg is broken, we should fix it. Here's my card. I'll send you an email. You follow up with me next week, and then we'll see if we want to fix your leg. You just let me know if you're interested, right? And then they just kind of like, and that's what salespeople do, coaches, consultants. They're all worried about the sales part because no one taught them how to do it.
Right.
But that doctor's not going to let you leave that ER with a broken leg if they can help it in any way possible. They're just going to assume that you're there, they're going to fix it. And that's the lesson in that Persuading Like a Professional course and the book, which is like, be a professional.
Yeah. Yeah. So the book and the course. Now, when you combine those two, that seems pretty powerful. I mean, when you combine those two, the book and the course, is the course interactive and it's an online deal, or is it more not interactive? What kind of interaction do you allow there or give during that course?
So it's an online self-paced video course
Oh,
that
okay,
goes
cool.
through a lot of lessons. And really what I did for that level, and, I have coaching programs as well as consulting, which is, kind of higher up, but
Yeah.
at least a resource and more information to dive deeper and to arm anybody in sales, no matter what you're selling, to like shift the mindset and have some tools and strategies to go after. It's the same thing with the book, right? The book is
Okay.
focused on anybody in sales. Just ways to shift that mindset and the strategy.
Where do you see sales training headed right now? If I were to ask you, I know the obvious is, well, we're in a pandemic and it's going virtual, but I'm talking, from an authentic and the persuasion standpoint, where do you see sales training going, in the future? How do you see it shifting?
I think there's a lot of technology now available, and it's getting cheaper and better and faster. The kind of stuff where, AI will listen to phone calls and then provide feedback and reports and all of these great things that you can do with the technology that's currently available. And so the training to me is shifting more to like, here's what we're, instead of teaching someone the basics, there's technology to cover the basics. There's technology to kind of give that feedback. And so how do we train, virtual, getting more and more effective at virtual, and using tools to balance the line between like training and coaching, because there's also only so much training you can do, right? You give somebody
Right.
training, they got to go out and try it, right? Like we can't sit in the
Yeah.
classroom and talk about tennis for too long until you got to go out there and try to
Yeah.
hit some balls. And then we
Yeah.
got to talk about it again. And then we got to look at some game footage, right?
Right.
And so that's the same thing with this, where I'm seeing a lot more micro coaching going on, even virtual, even by consultants or trainers, and or managers, which is like, okay, we're just going to do lots of little bits of coaching and training instead of like these massive, okay, let's do this week-long thing. We got to make sure everyone's still getting trained.
Yeah, I love that analogy on the tennis. I always like to use the golf analogy where, hey, I'm great on the driving range. I can hit golf balls all day and they go straight. I can hook, I can slice. I mean, I've got every shot, but at some point you got to go play and you got to know how to manage the course. You got to know how to score. And that's kind of how, you can train and read. And I'm a proponent of all of that. But at
Mhm.
some point, you got to go sit down with that CFO. You got to go make calls. You got to learn how to prospect and all of those things. So I think that's important from a sales professional standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, you got to put stuff into use. And then really the part that's usually missing the most in organizations is the feedback loop, right? Which is, I made a phone call, tell me how I did, right? I tried this new thing, but how did it go? And we're usually blind to our own feedback. So having someone else or technology give us the feedback. I mean, I work with so many clients where I'm like, okay, before we begin, send me some of the recordings. Let me hear stuff. And they're like, we don't have recordings, or I don't know where they are. I'm like, if you don't know where they are, it means nobody's listening to them.
Right.
How could you even coach or train your reps? And that's usually the first thing, is because again, get somebody a book or a training course, or hire a consultant and be like, try this. How do you know if it worked? Who's making sure it stays long term, which I think is the part organizations are shifting to.
Yeah, I was talking with a sales professional a few weeks ago, and actually was on the podcast. And they use a simulator. I don't know if you've had any experience with that, but it was actually, the way she was talking about it was actually pretty cool. I mean, it's a simulator that actually it's their philosophy is it's like a pilot. You wouldn't want your pilot practicing while he's flying you. You want him doing it in a simulator. Have you seen some of those kind of tools and that kind of work?
I have. I've, there's a lot of cool stuff that's happening and coming out and becoming scalable and cheaper and more available. You
Yeah.
don't have to be like just a giant organization who has a huge budget for that kind of thing. Yeah, lots of cool ways to simulate, to practice. And then using that flight analogy, right? There's practice in the sim. And again, like even your golfing thing, it's like, that's cool, but at some point you got to get in a plane and do it. But the thing is that you have somebody next to you who can take over the controls if things go sideways. And in sales, that's always important too. It's like, okay, we can practice, we can simulate, we can role play, and then someone's got to be there to kind of clean up the mess if things
Yeah.
go sideways.
Now, you've got a very successful podcast, the Sales Experience Podcast, 278 episodes. Um, tell me about that. Tell the listeners about your podcast, because I think they all, need to listen to it. I've listened to it, but where did that come from, and what was your inspiration for that? Well, that was pre the book, right? That was before the book, or were those kind of going on at the same time?
Those were going on at the same time. So I had written the first draft of the book and was starting my consulting business. And I was like, I just want to do a podcast, and not just from a, like, you got to put content out there and advertise and monetize, but more of just like, I had this thing inside of me and I just wanted to get it out and give that information and put it out there. But then also, have it be essentially a brochure for everything I know from a business perspective too. I mean, you listen to the show, it's like, okay, what is my focus and what can I help people? But it's been great. I mean, I'm crazy, so I do 5 days a week.
Yeah, that's
It's been a
impressive.
little over a year, and it's really focused. It's kind of like the book. It's like yourself with this show. It's like a lot of people in this kind of space, in this mindset, in this level, where the goal is just to help people do better at sales such that they're creating a much better sales experience for the customer and then for themselves, right? Like, so being a salesperson, there's an experience you have as well, either the, how do you sleep at night experience, or the, how am I going to succeed and what is my life like experience? And so how do you build that on both sides for the customer and for you, and really shift the way the world sees salespeople. Either whether it's an episode for myself or, with guests on there, that's really the focus, is how do you help anybody in any sales role or leadership or owners improve the sales process.
What's the, of 278 episodes, what's the one you remember the most? Or what's the one that you've been like, wow, that was just either a phenomenal, or man, on the other way, boy, I really messed that one up?
You know what? That's a tough one. I should have guessed that you have asked me this or wanted to bring this up. I mean, I can't. I mean, I had so many amazing guests so far and so many different things. I mean, season 1 was pretty much just myself, and each week was a different theme, and there was a lot of cool topics I just kind of dove into a lot.
Yeah.
And then my guests have been some really amazing people that on the surface, some of them are, let's say, competitors. I mean, they're consultants, they're coaches, they're people like myself. They have books, they're ahead of me in this and that. But it's, there's, from a place of abundance, there's so much knowledge out there and so many great conversations to have and to share, that it's all been fun. I mean, one of the ones that's the most interesting that always stands out that I tell people about is I interviewed a woman, and she is essentially, let's say, the sales director for a mortuary.
Oh,
So
wow.
she considers herself a salesperson, and she's helping people make end of life decisions, as she calls it, and then get their estate planning and their funeral plans all set up.
Okay.
And I always thought that would be the easiest thing, right? Death and taxes. It's the easiest thing to sell. It's like, no, because people don't want to admit their mortality. So it's actually really hard.
Yeah.
But it follows the same framework I've always used, like the rapport and the empathy and the trust building and all those steps you wouldn't think. Like, it'd be weird. You're selling heavy equipment. She sells mortuary, funeral plots.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. So that one's super fascinating. Just the topic most people don't think about with sales and selling.
Yeah. How about from a personal branding standpoint? Because I'm fascinated with, the sales profession, the personal branding. How has that helped you? It's had to be tremendous with the book and the podcast. And what's your advice to people out there in the sales profession that may be saying, I don't really want to go out there and put my foot in that water and get heavily involved in LinkedIn, or, what will people think about that? How do you kind of coach people through that process?
And I will say the caveat with that is I am no expert on personal branding. I kind of go and then stop and go and definitely not like some people out there. There are some amazing people who put out just great content all the time, and they're personal branding experts. So this is coming from me. I've seen them all. I know who they are, and they do amazing work. So I'll just steal their ideas and what they say. But then also for myself, I think even if you're SDR, telemarketer, up to salesperson, sales leader, I think it's super important to have a good presence online. If you're in a B2B space, it's even more important because people are going to look you up. The one thing to keep in mind, and again, you might not be using social media or a content strategy or personal branding strategy as a way to generate leads, right? And that's two different things. There's lead generation, and then there's just personal branding.
Right.
But always remember, and this is where a big shift is happening in the world in the last few years, is your potential customers know more about you or your product or your service than you think the first time they talk to you. I guarantee they've researched it. Think about how many people now would walk into a car dealership, sight unseen, no research, no idea what they want to do. They don't know what they want to buy. They don't know what the prices are, and then walk out a few hours later with a new car. Right? How many people are going to do that versus that was the thing 10, 15, 20 years ago? There was no comparison. There was, hey, I'm going to go buy a copy of Kelley Blue Book or look in the newspaper and see what cars cost. Otherwise, they hold all the cards. The dealership has all the information. Right. And now it's shifted. So if you come from that place, you realize how much personal branding is important, no matter who you are at any level in a company, because your potential customer is going to search for you and look you up and see, is this somebody I want to deal with? Do I trust them? Do I like their content? And am I going to give them a shot at my wallet?
Yeah, no, That's huge. And I agree with you, not only from a car dealership standpoint, but any business now. I mean, the buyer is informed. I don't care whether they're procurement or they're a manager or whatever. If they're calling you, they know, like you said, as much about they have access to as much about your product as they need. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah. And that's where I see a lot of sales people go wrong and still kind of miss the mark in the old school way is they feel that their job is to inform, right? They feel like I've got the knowledge because I'm at the company and I'm the smart one and I went through training and I have the brochure and I have the PowerPoint deck. So I'm the smart one who I'm going to give you the knowledge, right? And this is where they say, don't, don't sell the features, sell the benefits. But it's even more than that, right? What your customers want, again, could be a homeowner, could be an individual consumer, it could be the procurement person at a giant corporation. What they want is your wisdom, right? And I have this quote, and I found this, and I had to put it into the book, and it's by Miles Kington, and it goes, "Knowledge is knowing that tomato is a fruit, right? Wisdom is knowing not to put it into a fruit salad." And that's what your customers want. They want to know, like, they've got knowledge. They can search it on their phone while talking to you. They've got information. They've got knowledge. What they want is your wisdom.
Yeah. No, that's great. How do you think sales professionals today, what's the top ways that you've seen? How do you add value now? That's almost a buzzword anymore, as you know, you've got, but it's true. And even though it's a buzzword, how have you done that? And not only your consulting business, but how you coach others to really, you need to add value to that process.
It goes back to something I said earlier, which is spending the most amount of time reasonable. And every conversation is different, but spending that time on the discovery, the questions, the fact finding, the digging. One of the biggest things that I see as successful salespeople are just ultra curious. If there's one thing that, as a trait, there's grit and there's persistence and there's all these other things. But if we're talking at some level, like the one thing a lot of my guests have said is curiosity made them successful. And then they're also their sales teams. And it's just being curious about that other person. Because then what will happen, to answer your question, is you're super curious, you dive deep, you ask lots of questions. And then what comes out of that at the other end is, okay, based on what I learned, I can help with this with my product or service. Oh, also based on what they said, I know somebody who can help with this. Oh, I know a good book that they might like. They should check out this. They should check out this resource. Oh, I could send them this podcast. Oh, they would love this course. And then you're like this connector hub of
Yeah.
ways to do it. And it doesn't feel like, okay, I talked to a marketing person. Okay, what are the case studies I must send them to build value like a robot? No,
Right.
it's like, okay, I talked to Bill and Bill was telling me he has this issue. It's like, boom, I don't have it. I don't even care. I'm going to send you John's podcast because that will solve your issue. And then now I'm building value. And it's so authentic and it's so easy because you're just curious and then you just want to help.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's fantastic. I love that hub concept, because it's easy to put in a sequence and, oh, I'm going to email them this, or I'm going to email them that. It kind of almost isn't authentic at that point.
No.
What would you tell a younger 27-year-old like yourself that's thinking about getting in sales? What would you tell that person, and what kind of advice would you give them and say, hey, here's what you need to get ready for. Here's where you need to start.
I think the first part would be the authenticity piece. I think that's super important. And that's the challenging part. If I look back at my younger self, I thought I was self-aware. I thought I had, ideas of who I was and my strengths and my weaknesses. And then of course that evolves and you get deeper into things and you really, open up and discover. But I think that's really the key is that self-awareness piece that leads to the authenticity, which is, what are my strengths? Why am I wanting to do this? Why do I want to be in sales? Like, what am I going to put on my vision board? What's important to me? And not just money. It's got to be something else, like that the money is getting you to, or that it's meaning, for you. Like, the more you have that, the easier it is to just persist and go through. And I think that's the first key to, like, that younger, brand new in sales, like, figure out who you are, figure out what you're good at, what your strengths are, and then stick with that. Learn and absorb from other people, be a sponge and try to get as much info as you can and see what's working for other people. Just be careful not to copy them, right? Because the guy in the cube next to you is really good, like boiler room at closing deals. Like
Yeah.
maybe don't copy that person, because you got to be careful with that. So I think that's really the key. And then, the other part, if anyone's really thinking about doing it as a career or think that might be where they want to be in sales as an umbrella, not just one product or service, is play the long game and put in lots of effort. I mean, that 10,000 hours Malcolm Gladwell outliers principle takes 10,000 hours to be a master at something. It's true.
Oh
And
yeah.
so if you're in sales and you're 27, you can do well, you can make some money, you will achieve mastery if you put in the effort and you're always learning and always growing and treating it like a professional career, and you play the long game with it, then it will happen. Just look long term.
Yeah. Do you think good sales professionals in the field or an inside sales guy or girl, did that mean they're going to be a good manager, even if they're successful in sales? How much of that have you seen where people promote someone and they're like, oh, this guy was a great, and I'm not saying that's a bad idea. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
does that mean they are going to be a good sales manager?
I feel like first when you were
You're
saying this, it felt
grinning.
like it felt like a trap, like you were trying to trap me into saying something. And then I know what you're asking, and that is a situation. I was going to say problem, but that is a situation that a lot of organizations do. They fall into that. Usually, what happens is it's not so much, hey, there's Kim, and we think she'll be an amazing manager. Usually what happens in organizations is, oh crap, we need a manager. Who do we have? We need to move somebody up, right? So it's filling holes in the organization as something grows or if somebody leaves out of desperation, and then picking from the bench and not necessarily, being strategic and thoughtful and getting the right person. It happens all the time where companies think the top salesperson or the top engineer or the top website developer or anybody should be the manager because they know it and they know it really well and they could teach it and help everyone else. And it's generally not. I mean, I think, it's one of those things where you don't see a lot of professional, like top performing elite professional athletes go into coaching.
Right.
Right.
It's a small percentage.
It's a super small percentage. Most of them don't. Most of the people that are coaches were okay, mediocre, average-ish players in their sport, but they were really good coaches and really good teachers and really good leaders.
Yeah.
Top performers, let's say like a LeBron James. Sometimes with those kind of performers, they're so good at it because A, they worked hard all their life. B, they have some natural genetic abilities that go along with it that they can't tell you how to do better. What do you mean you can't shoot free throws? What do you mean you can't dunk? Just dunk. Like, here, watch, I'll show you. And I see that as salespeople who be like really good salespeople who become managers. They're like, what do you mean you can't? What do you mean you didn't ask these questions? What do you mean you didn't say this? Like, here, let me show you. And then, but they're not, they don't know how to translate and teach what they know.
Right.
It's one of the special things I know, like in one of my strengths is that I can do it, but then I can also hear it and then I can teach it in other people and be able to bridge that, which a lot of people aren't necessarily able to do. That's why some really good salespeople, if you're a self-aware organization, you leave them as top salespeople and you find a different manager because otherwise you're going to screw up many things at once.
Yeah.
Of course, there's a chance that a top sales rep could be a top manager. The challenge is, and here's what's really happens, is if you have a really good sales rep and you make them a manager, then what happens is you have a really skilled manager who knows how to sell. And I promise you that anytime there's an issue, a challenge, a quota that's not met, numbers that are not met, an issue, anything that happens from the sales team, they will be selling the leadership above them on why it's not their fault and why it's not the team's fault. They are in sales mode and you can't turn that off. And so nothing will ever, they'll always be trying to close you on something. And you got to be careful with that.
Yeah. That's a great point you made about the coaches, when the athletes not necessarily doesn't necessarily transfer to you being a good, you look at the Lou Holtzes and so they weren't necessarily the best players,
Nope.
maybe the John Woodens but man, they could teach most great coaches are great teachers and leaders. And that's a great point you make. So I try to ask a lot of people that just because I'm interested they all kind of, they lean towards that, what you just said. And it's interesting. I've got one
Yeah.
more question for you. But before I ask that question, tell everybody where they can get this great book that you've written, the new book. Tell them where they can get in touch with you. Tell them about, where to get in touch with the podcast, but go ahead and let everybody know where they can get a hold of you.
I've made it super simple because I have all these projects on different websites and different locations. So the easiest thing is to go to jasoncutter.com. And
Okay.
so there's a hub there. It's kind of like Linktree, where that site is just a hub to point to everything else. But there's link on there for the book, for the course that you mentioned, for where to find the podcast. The podcast is easy. It's on all the platforms. So wherever you get your podcast from, you can find it. But otherwise, go to jasoncutter.com. There's a link on there for setting up a call with me, for reaching out to me, for my LinkedIn profile. Like, that's the easiest place.
Okay. Awesome. So all you Sales Vitamins listeners, get to that website, get this book, Selling with Authentic Persuasion, Transforming from Order Taker to Quota Breaker. Get that book, run to your computer, hit the button, and he'll get it to you. Last question. You've got one sales vitamin. That's all you've got today. And you're going to give somebody some professional sales advice. What's that one sales vitamin that you give them?
I would say come from a place of empathy and care about your prospects, and you will always win, right? Sometimes maybe not short term. It might feel like it. Long term, you will always win in those relationships, in sales in general. Caring about the well-being of your prospects, whether you can help them or not, is like, if I had to pick one, that's it. That's winning right there.
Awesome. All right. Jason Cutter, it has been great to have you on today, man. I mean, they got a ton of vitamins, the book, the podcast, a former marine biologist. I don't know that I've ever talked to a marine biologist. You may be the first and especially, I know I've never talked to anybody that's tagged sharks. So
Cool.
that is cool. But man, it's been a pleasure to have you on today.
Thanks, John, for having me.
You bet.